Before pillows came with brand names and mattresses needed unboxing videos, the citizens of Rome slept beneath an empire, or, more accurately, beneath creaky beams, faded murals, and occasionally a stray scorpion. Tonight, we'll drift into a world where senators whispered under candlelight, gladiators collapsed on stone floors, and even emperors dreamt of things they couldn't conquer. So, settle in, dim the lights, let the hum of whatever keeps your room from feeling empty become your lullaby, and let's wander, slowly, into sleep in ancient Rome. Nightfall was not the end of the day, it was simply a shift in the rhythm of living. Without electric lights or Netflix cliffhangers, the Romans obeyed the natural cycle of the sun. When it dipped beyond the rooftops of insulae and palaces, a softer world began to emerge. Shops closed, temples darkened, and the city that had thundered with trade, gossip, and the occasional chariot crash exhaled. The rich might retire to their triclinium for a final sip of wine, reclining on couches once filled with conversation and scandal. The poor, however, wound down differently, in cramped tenements stacked like uneven bricks. Families prepared to rest in the same corner they had cooked dinner and dried laundry. There was no turning off the day, only laying beside it. Beds, such as they weren't always made for comfort. The patricians, Rome's elite, had the luxury of wooden frames, strung with leather or rope, topped with wool-stuffed mattresses and layered with imported linens from Egypt or dyed blankets from Gaul. Pillows, stuffed with feathers or even wool, gave some sense of softness. But they were nothing like the marshmallow clouds we debate firmness over today. For the plebeians, the common folk, the idea of a bed was more flexible. A bundle of straw, a folded cloak, a worn-out tunic stretched across two planks. If you were lucky, a cousin wouldn't be already sleeping in your favorite corner. Whole families shared rooms, shared beds, even shared breath. Children nestled against parents, grandparents, curled by the hearth, and sometimes a borrowed neighbor snored in rhythm with the dog. Privacy wasn't a concept. It was a myth passed between those who had never known communal walls. The city itself didn't go quiet. Far from it. As the markets shuttered and bathhouses emptied, the nighttime workers emerged. Bakers began their work while the streets still echoed with silence, kneading dough under oil lamps, filling alleys with the early scent of tomorrow. Guards patrolled with torches, their sandals scraping against worn stones. And in the Subura district, known for its shadowy dealings and rented beds, not everyone went to sleep or even to sleep at all. The Romans practiced something curious with their nights. Much like their medieval descendants, segmented sleep was a reality. First sleep came naturally, drawn by exhaustion and darkness. Then, often in the quiet middle, they'd awaken, not startled, not disturbed, just ... Awake. Some used the time to pray silently to household gods, their Lares and Pinates, whose tiny shrines perched in corners like forgotten relatives. Others would write letters by lamplight, murmur verses from Virgil, or simply listen to the sounds of dripping water, creaking beams, distant laughter, or the occasional rat making existential decisions near the pantry. Married couples used the interlude to reconnect, to speak softly without interruption. No children asking about dinner, no visitors, just the two of them, together in that sacred stillness between sleeps. And for those who couldn't afford stillness, the night was a second shift. Lamp makers, fishmongers, porters all found tasks beneath the moon. Rome never truly slept. It only blinked slowly, like a tired giant waiting for the next battle. Let's talk about what Romans wore to bed. Not silk robes or tailored nightwear, but tunics. Long, loose, and usually the same ones worn all day. The idea of changing into something for sleep was foreign. Why soil a second garment when one already bore the stains of the day? Nudity, however, was not entirely frowned upon. In fact, it was common among those who had a room to themselves, rare though that was. It wasn't indecent, it was practical. Fewer fleas, fewer folds to trap sweat in the summer. And in the colder months, more skin against skin meant more warmth, especially when the fire had long since gone out. As for pillows, not everyone had them. Some used folded tunics, others used their arms. The truly resourceful used their sandals leather, tough enough to support a head, even if it smelled of a 12-hour shift. Now, if you think your upstairs neighbor is loud, imagine sleeping in a Roman insula. These multi-story apartment buildings often leaned at strange angles. Built quickly, with little concern for longevity, they creaked, moaned, and occasionally collapsed. Walls were thin. Conversations passed through plaster like water through cloth. You knew your neighbor's arguments, their meals, their snores. You even knew when they rolled over. But you didn't complain, because complaining didn't fix the wall. And besides, you were probably just as loud. Wealthier citizens, of course, had grander arrangements. Villas, with courtyards, bedrooms with painted walls and mosaic floors. Beds that didn't creak unless they were supposed to. But even here, sleep was sacred, not luxurious. One's rest was tied to one's virtue. The Stoics preached moderation, even in dreams. Too much comfort softened the spirit, and dreams are dreams were another matter entirely. Romans believed dreams were messages from gods, from ancestors, from the deeper, stranger parts of the self. A dream of falling might be a warning, a dream of flying, perhaps the favor of Mercury. Entire books were written to decode nocturnal visions. Dream interpreters were sought after, priests consulted, and if the dream was bad enough, sacrifices made, not dramatic ones, but maybe a loaf of bread, a few drops of wine, a whispered apology. To Jupiter, the emperors had their own dream rituals. Augustus, famously cautious, would rise after a troubling vision and consult his household priest. Nero, ever the dramatist, would claim divine guidance in dreams when it suited him, and Caligula, best not to discuss his dreams. Some things are better left in shadow, but for most Romans, dreams were not just symbols, they were chances to see the future, to speak with the dead, to remember a love that had long since faded into the Tiber's mist. Let's not forget the role of animals. Cats curled on rooftops. Dogs wandered freely in and out of houses. Birds nested above beams, sometimes chirping at strange hours. And in the countryside, sheep were more than warm, they were a heating system with hooves. No one slept alone unless they had to, in Rome. Nighttime wasn't lonely. It was layered. It held secrets, murmurs, prayers, memories, and echoes of sandals fading into distance. The moonlight turned walls silver, and every stone remembered a whisper. So tonight, as you drift into your own quiet world, imagine the soft flicker of a Roman oil lamp. Picture the hum of the city at rest, the sigh of a citizen settling into straw, the faint clink of a sword leaned carefully against a doorframe. You're not alone in the dark. You never were. Sleep, to the Romans, was not only a reprieve, it was a negotiation. A dialogue between the body and the soul, between the day that had just faded and the one that waited, unseen, on the other side of dawn. And in this quiet treaty, rituals mattered before the last oil lamp was snuffed, before the final yawn surrendered to silence. Many Romans performed small acts of protection. They muttered charms, tied little knots in thread, touched a talisman 3 times. The world, after all, was not just what you could sit, was alive with spirits, omens, and forgotten gods who still wandered the rooftops when the city slept. One such spirit, the genius, Lozai, was believed to inhabit every place, every room, every home, even the cramped corner beneath the staircase where a boy laid his head beside a sleeping chicken. There, too, was a spirit, watching, guarding, or perhaps just waiting to be remembered. Sleep required appeasement. You didn't just close your eyes and drift. You folded yourself into a world laced with meaning, hoping that nothing from the other side folded itself into you. In wealthier households, small shrines called lareia stood tucked into niches near the kitchen or the atrium, their tiny clay figures smiling, dancing, holding out cornucopias, watched over the home and its inhabitants. Before bed, a few drops of wine might be offered, a morsel of bread, a whispered thanks. Not every offering was grand. Sometimes the smallest token meant the greatest reverence. Children mimicked their parents, standing barefoot and drowsy in long tunics, imitating gestures they only half understood. But even mimicry held meaning. It taught them that sleep was not just rest, it was surrender. A small death from which one hoped to return in peace. And while some homes were quiet at night, others whispered with unrest. For there were those in Rome who did not welcome the dark. Veterans of forgotten battles, women who carried grief like a necklace, men who drank too much too early and remembered too vividly too late. For them, night was a reckoning. Not soft, not soothing, but a mirror, reflecting what daylight had. Politely ignored, in such moments, people turned to other forms of comfort. Amulets, shaped like phalluses, oddly enough, were a favorite not because they were obscene, but because they were believed to ward off evil. They hung above cradles, were carved into walls, even worn on chains during sleep. A strange defense, perhaps, but one the Romans took seriously. Others kept small pots of herbs near their beds. Lavender, rue, mint, not just for scent, but for symbolism. Each plant held meaning, each leaf a story. Some protected against nightmares, others against illness. Some, like vervain, were said to encourage dreams of love, if placed beneath one's pillow with proper intention and the right phase of the moon. Dreams, once they arrived, were rarely passive. They were adventures, warnings, messages in metaphors. A senator might dream of a crumbling pillar and wake convinced the republic was in danger. A mother might dream of clear water and take it as a sign that her unborn child would be born healthy. A baker, covered in flour and fatigue, might dream of fire, not the oven's flame, but something deeper, something he wouldn't speak of aloud. Not all dreams were welcomed. Some were feared. Incubi and succubi spirits of the night were blamed for unsettling visions. They pressed down on chests, tangled limbs, left dreamers breathless and disturbed. The line between dream and visitation was thin. If you woke drenched in sweat, your mouth dry, your heart racing, was it something you ate, or something that had visited? To protect against such entities, some slept with iron under their bed, others with bits of coral. A few recited protective verses before sleep, their voices soft, half believing, half daring whatever waited in the dark to prove itself. Still, despite all this ritual and preparation, most Romans slept deeply. Their days were long, their lives full, whether hauling water from distant fountains, reciting poetry in shaded gardens, or sweeping ash from temple floors. The body tired itself into peace. Even the streets, so noisy by day, seemed to sigh when darkness took over. The Tiber flowed slower, or at least seemed to. Its surface reflected torchlight like scattered stars. Boats rocked gently against their moorings, and the echoes of conversation faded into the stones. In the countryside, sleep was simpler, but no less sacred. Farmers finished their last tasks under the fading light, tying up animals, covering embers, checking the sky with experienced eyes. They didn't need clocks. They had shadows, the tilt of the moon, the hush of birds. A family might sleep together in a single-room parents near the fire. Children huddled on pallets, a dog stretched long across the doorway. The wind rustled olive trees outside. Occasionally, the distant bark of a fox. But otherwise, quiet. Some slept under open skies. Shepherds, soldiers, wanderers. They looked up at constellations the same as ours, though they named them differently. Not Orion, but the hunter with stories lost to time. Not the Big Dipper, but a chariot in the heavens. The sky was their blanket, stars their sentries. Of course, not everyone found comfort in silence. The city had its sounds, water trickling in aqueducts, the distant shout of someone who had drunk too deeply, the creak of wheels on cobblestones as a late cart made its way home, and always the distant murmur of prayer's Latin words repeated by habit, not always hope. Even within temples, night had a rhythm. Priests sometimes stayed awake, tending sacred fires. The flame of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, was never allowed to die. In her temple, the Vestal virgins kept watch, their days regimented, their sleep scheduled. For them, rest was duty-ascent, sacred, timed, and yet even they dreamed. Of what, we do not know. But their journals, fragments of which remain, speak of visions, of warmth, of faces not seen for years. Even the pious longed for comfort. There were also the night criminals, pickpockets who worked better in shadow, smugglers on silent boats, and informants who whispered to the guards under the promise of coin or clemency. It was said that Rome had 100 eyes during the day, but 1,000 ears at night. To sleep then was to trust. To close your eyes was to surrender control to the city, to the spirits, to the quiet hands of fate. Perhaps that's why some Romans left letters near their beds. Not just wills, but small notes. Messages for whoever might find them if they did not wake. Some were of debts, names of relatives, instructions for burial. Others were poetic, final thoughts, one last prayer, a hope written in ink. Children were often taught a bedtime chant, passed from mother to daughter, father to son. It changed from house to house, but the meaning was the same. Sleep safely, wake gladly. If you do not wake, walk in the light. Soft farewell, just in case. And so, as the stars turned above the 7 hills, and the Forum lay blanketed in shadow, Rome drifted, not in perfect peace, but in collective rest. The baker's hands, dusted in flour, curled softly beside a worn apron. The philosopher's scroll lay open, a line of Cicero still lingering in the mind. A merchant muttered about coin lost, and coin gained. A priest dreamed of clouds parting above a marble altar, and you wandering now through this ancient night. Perhaps you can hear the hush, the slow breathing of 1,000 dreams. The city wrapped in layers of straw, wool, memory, and prayer. Tomorrow would bring noise again, orders shouted, fires rekindled, the clang of iron, the crack of gossip, the morning rush for water and bread. But not yet. Now the city slept, and so should you. But the night had not yet surrendered all its secrets. Beyond the slumbering silhouettes of Florence's tiled rooftops, a slow wind stirred the crooked shutters of the Via dei Servi. A velvet hush cloaked the sleeping city, but in the Medici archive, the candle still burned, soft and flickering. Its light danced like a hesitant confession across Matteo's worn features. His fingers trembled, not from exhaustion, but from discovery. The letter had not been the last. Beneath the gilded vellum that bore Cosimo's seal, there had been more, 2 pages carefully concealed beneath a false bottom panel of the box. They were older, torn at the edges. One bore the water-stained mark of the papal court in a vineyard. The other, barely legible, held the broken Latin of a hand untrained in diplomacy. Though clearly desperate to be understood, he sat back slowly, breath shallow. This was not just correspondence. This was conspiracy. The second page, in particular, held chilling lines. Half-coded, tangled in allegory, but unmistakable in tone. Someone had written of an arrangement involving a shipment not of silk or spice, but of people, artists, scholars, dissidents, a silent exodus. Matteo's mind turned inward, swirled by questions. Why would Cosimo de' Medici, patron of brilliance and bearer of Florence's torch, conceal this? Had he brokered a hidden accord to safeguard minds deemed dangerous by Rome? Or was this part of something darker, a culling of those who knew too much? From the inky shadows behind the archive shelves, the city's ghostly whispers seemed to swell. Distant hoofbeats along cobbled streets, the thud of a wooden shutter closing in haste. Florence always listened, and tonight, perhaps it was whispering back. Matteo carefully folded the pages again, returned them to the carved box, and slid the panel back into place. Then he sealed it not with wax, but with an iron resolve. Tomorrow he would go to the Palazzo Vecchio, not as a scribe, not as a scholar, but as a seeker, a quiet crusader. The dawn would rise with more than light. It would bring questions to the doors of power. But that was still hours away, now. Sleep called, and as he closed the great ledger and laid the letterbox gently atop it, Matteo drew the candle closer. The flame warmed his lined face and caught. The glint of tears he had not known were there. Not from fear, from awe, from the weight of standing on the threshold of history. Sleep found him at the desk, head tilted back, mouth slightly open, the candle guttering low. The Medici seal stared back at him, quiet and regal on the lid of the box. And all around him, Florence exhaled. Morning in Florence did not arrive in haste. It crept over the clay tiles and moss-laced fountains like a thief with silken feet. The bells of San Marco tolled a soft matins. Pigeons gathered in the eaves. The scent of stone warmed by sun mingled with the distant aroma of baked bread and fennel. Matteo woke before the bells ended. He had not changed his clothes. His neck ached from the desk's edge. Yet he stood refreshed. Steeled by the hour of tears, he walked through the doors of the Palazzo Vecchio, the city's heart and lungs, carrying nothing but the letter in a small pouch and his name in his mouth. Matteo of Via del Terme. He said to the guard in green and crimson livery, "I am expected." He was not. But he said it with such calm confidence that the man blinked twice before stepping aside. Perhaps Florence still honored conviction. Through vaulted corridors, past fading frescoes of ducal triumphs, Matteo walked. The vast Sala dei Cinquecento loomed ahead, but he turned leftward, the lesser chamber. The hidden one, the Archivum, Privatum. And there he waited. It was not long, a man arrived, young, hair combed with oil, face pale and lips set tight. Not a Medici, but someone close. An assistant, perhaps. A whisperer. "You have something," the man said, without asking a name. His voice was clipped. "I do," said Matteo. He withdrew the sealed letter, handed it over. "Read." The man did not reach for it. He stared at Matteo's eyes first, as though measuring soul against paper. Then, slowly, he took the vellum, broke the wax. Silence stretched after several minutes. The man exhaled. "Where did you find this?" "In a forgotten box." "I do not think it was meant to be opened." "This is not for you to understand," the man said stiffly, eyes darting. "Then why was it written in Latin, so broken even I can decipher its truth?" The man said nothing. Matteo stepped closer. "You fear it because it names names. Scholars from Pisa, painters from Siena, even to sons of Rome herself smuggled from under the papal eye. They were protected, hidden, or silenced." The man's hands curled around the parchment. Matteo's voice lowered to a whisper. "If Cosimo protected them, then Florence owes him not shame but reverence. But if he betrayed them, then Florence must know." "I will take this to the archivist," the man said finally. "And then too, no, you will not." Matteo reached inside his cloak and produced a second letter. "A copy. I have 10 such duplicates. One already rests with the prior of Santa Croce, another will be sent north to Venice. If I vanish, these do not. You're bluffing, am I?" Their eyes locked. Then the man folded the letter slowly, carefully, as if it were a relic. "We will speak again," he said. "You know where I write." As the man turned and disappeared behind a door draped in velvet, Matteo exhaled, not from relief, but from resolve. The game had begun. That evening, Florence felt different. The sky was bluer, or perhaps the world just seemed sharper through. Eyes no longer dulled by caution. Matteo crossed the Arno by the Ponte Vecchio. The sun danced in fractured gold upon the river, and the wind carried laughter and lute music from an upper window. Boats bobbed lazily below. He reached the Oltrarno side and turned left, weaving past linen shops and copper forges, until he came to a modest building with vines creeping along its face. It had once belonged to a minor poet. Now it was home. To someone even more dangerous, a living memory. Giulia. She opened the door before he knocked. "You came," she said simply. "I had to." Julia had not changed. Grey at her temples now, perhaps, and fine lines around her mouth, but her eyes sharp as razors. They had once traded verses, then secrets. She poured wine, red and dry. So she asked, "I found something." She tilted her head. He told her everything. The box, the letter, the meeting at the palazzo, the quiet threat. When he was done, she nodded slowly. "I knew Cosimo played a deeper game, but not this deep. You were always braver than I," she smiled. "I was always more foolish." They laughed, and then the silence returned, warm and heavy. "You'll need allies," she said. I thought I had one. She poured more wine. You have two. Night deepened outside. The streets emptied. The wind changed. And in the hush of her study, with books lining every wall, Matteo realized what must come next. If Cosimo had orchestrated the smuggling of forbidden mines, then somewhere, somehow there had to be a list, a ledger, a record. And if such a ledger existed, it would not be in the Medici vaults. It would be hidden where only ghosts remembered. Later, when the candles flickered low and sleep returned, Matteo sat beside the window, watching the city breathe. Bells chimed the hour softly in the distance. Florence, in all her layered mystery, was not just marble and fresco. She was a vault of memory, a cathedral of forgotten truths. And tonight, Matteo knew he would open every locked door, even if it cost him everything. The candles had melted low in the ducal chambers of Palazzo Vecchio, casting long, flickering shadows that played upon frescoed walls and whispering drapery. Florence slept beyond the arched windows, its breath shallow, as though the city itself feared to wake. Inside, beneath painted ceilings of cosmic maps and golden cherubs, Giulio moved with the hush of habit, hands gloved, tools wrapped in velvet dot. He was no longer just the locksmith. He had become ill, so Charutha whisper, and every night since his meeting with Lorenzo de' Medici, he had not returned home to the workshop above the Arno. Instead, he was summoned into rooms never opened to the daylight, where secrets grew, like vines along the baseboards of the city's power. Tonight, he waited in the Sala dei Gigli, the grand hall of lilies, where blue irises burst upon golden walls and stone lions gazed upon nothing. Lorenzo's secretary, a young man named Bartolomeo, with the eyes of a falcon and the voice of a monk, had instructed him to wait by the lion statue near the north wall. So there Giulio stood, half a ghost, in the hush of moonlight, his mind adrift in quiet things. He had not told anyone, not even old Annetta, where he now went at night. Each evening she would wrap a cloth around his supper and say, "The night is thick, boy. Don't lose your way to the stars." And each night he kissed her on the head and vanished before the bells tolled 9. But what he did in those hours, what he made Evan and Netta could never guess. There was movement now. Footsteps, bare, like silk sweeping stone. Bartolomeo appeared. From behind the carved partition, a cloak over one shoulder, eyes sharp and breath shallow. "You're ready." "I've been waiting," Giulio answered, tone even. "Come, we go below." They passed through a door Giulio had never seen, concealed behind a tapestry of Apollo and Daphne, and descended a stair no broader than a chimney flue. Down they crept, torch in hand, into the bowel of the palace cellars that were not cellars, halls that bore no names. Here ancient Roman stone met Etruscan brick, and time became thick like wine left too long to ferment. The scent was neither mildew nor mold, but memory, the heavy kind. Locked in rust and mortar, Bartolomeo stopped at a door of wrought iron bars, strange for its design. Not a cell, not a vault, something older. He handed Giulio a scrap of parchment. Upon it, a diagram, strange ridges, a pinwheel mechanism, a six-toothed barrel surrounded by shifting levers. Giulio took one look and whispered, "This isn't Florentine. This isn't even Lombard. It's Roman," Bartolomeo murmured. "Salvaged from under San Miniato. The maestro wants it replicated." Giulio blinked. Lorenzo knew. The other. The passage from light to darkness had always felt short to Giulio. His mind adjusted quickly, and his hands, always his hands, found their work regardless of the light. He knelt beside the ancient lock and studied its housing. No keyhole in the usual sense. The mechanism was embedded into the stone, circular and sunken. He pried gently with his awl, watching the inner chamber shift like a blooming flower under pressure. It moved in layers like the planets around, the sun each piece affecting the next. A planetary lock. He exhaled slowly, fascinated. His thumb brushed the diagram again. This must have taken a Legion smith to forge. The tolerance. He muttered. Bartolomeo said nothing, merely watched, his arms folded beneath the folds of his cloak. Giulio worked in silence for another hour, mapping the lock not with chalk but with his fingers and mind. Every turn, every counterspin, committed to the muscle of his memory. Finally, he sat back. I can replicate it, but I'll need time, and brass, and solitude. Bartolomeo nodded. It will be arranged, but there's something else. Giulio's brows raised. You're not just replicating the lock. You're installing it, and once it's placed, no one must open it again. Not unless they hold the key you will design. Giulio understood. This wasn't a door to be locked. It was a truth to be buried. For days he worked in silence. The workshop above the Arno, once filled with cheerful clinking and street laughter, became a sanctum. The shutters stayed closed. Annetta brought food and said nothing, though she watched him longer than usual each evening. Brass gears, bone wheels, steel memory springs. Giulio poured his being into the copano, the offspring of the Roman lock, and while he worked, he began to dream of corridors without end, of doors that breathed, of a golden room hidden beneath the roots of Florence, where light had never touched and yet shadows still moved. It was midnight when Bartolomeo returned. They descended again, the room now lit with oil lamps in iron sconces. 3 men waited in silence. One was Lorenzo calm, noble-faced, yet worn. Another was a hooded man Giulio had seen once before in the Piazza known, yet with the bearing of someone who was never stopped. The third was tall, gaunt, with spectacles and robes covered in silver thread. His hands were gloved, his voice low. Is it ready? Asked the tall one. Giulio bowed and produced the lock. It gleamed dully, no ornament, just truth. 6 interlocked arms, 2 planetary wheels, and a key shaped like no key ever made. I'll install it now, he said. They parted to let him pass. The door was already set with a copper housing. As instructed, Giulio pressed the new lock into the cradle. It clicked, then he inserted the key. It turned with a sigh, as if something ancient had just inhaled after centuries. The lock sealed the door. Whatever lay beyond, it was now hidden behind. An idea forged by human hands. The hooded man stepped forward, examining Giulio. You are precise. I am a locksmith, Giulio replied. No, you are something else now. The man reached into his cloak and drew a ribbon red silk, embroidered with a sun and a blade. Welcome to the Custodi del Silenzio. Giulio blinked. I don't. You will understand in time. For now, you forget what you saw tonight. You remember only that you made a beautiful lock for the Medici, and that your silence feeds the city more than your speech. Lorenzo stepped forward. His hand on Giulio's shoulder was firm, not warm. Florence survives on secrets. You've kept one now, and one day you may keep many, he returned. Home just before dawn. Annetta stirred in the other room. He placed the key in a box and slid it beneath the floorboards. Then he sat, hands aching. and looked at his own reflection in the cold window glass. He had locked a door to something he could not name, but even in his bones, he knew this. Some doors do not open to rooms. They open to errors, and he had just locked one shut. Let the city hum in hush again, dear listener. Let the whispers of Thessaloniki resume their gentle murmur, where dust from sandal soles still floats like golden pollen across the flagstones of ancient streets. Let us once more drift into the olive-scented breath of a city dreaming, where pomegranate lanterns blink softly behind shutters, and in the slow cradle of time, a tale unspools, again unhurried and hushed. The sun had long set when Leandros emerged from the underground channel, near the old Roman rotunda, blinking like a mole cast into moonlight. The taste of earth and copper still clung to the roof of his mouth. Behind him, darkness swallowed the secret path, the network of tunnels he and Moria had used to dodge the watchful eyes of Byzantine patrols. Moria walked ahead now, silent as snowfall, her footsteps as quiet as folded cloth. They emerged into the back courtyard of the monastery of Latimos, where pale mosaics shimmered like ghostlight upon weathered stone. A solitary fig tree leaned in the corner, dropping shadows like spilled ink to night. Leandros was not merely a thief. Tonight, he was a ghost moving through alleys that remembered him, ducking under laundry lines and chapel bells. His fingertips still tingled from the iron vault they had opened, where secrets older than emperors slept beneath layers of dust and incense. Gold, no, scrolls. Old documents in Latin, Greek, and Syriac, fragile as moth wings, curled with time, sealed with the wax of long-dead patriarchs. They had stolen not coin, but history, and someone, somewhere, would want them back. "Where do we go now?" Leandros whispered, breath visible in the coolness of night. Moria paused by a stone, archway overgrown with ivy. Her eyes, flecked with embers from candlelight memory, darted toward the harbor. "There's a merchant ship," she murmured, docked under Cypriot flags. "Its captain owes me a favor." She didn't elaborate. Moria never did. Her past was stitched with silence, a tapestry woven in whispers. Leandros followed without question, as he always had since that night near the meat market, when she had plucked him from the jaws of execution and stitched his gashed arm with a needle she kept in her boot. Through the hills they moved, along the crumbling walls of Theodosian brickwork where ivy strangled stone, down past the Jewish quarter, through alleys where prayers were spoken in Ladano under breath, and into the slumbering heart of a city not yet sure it had entered a new century. At the harbor, sea fog kissed the cobblestones. Masts loomed like the ribs of sleeping giants. Lanterns swung gently on salt-wet ropes, and distant bells from the church of St. Demetrius chimed thrice, a metallic lullaby for those who still wandered. The ship was there, squat and shadow-cloaked, a vessel worn thin by years of piracy and barter. Its timbers creaked softly, like a bed disturbed by old secrets. Moria signaled to a deckhand, a boy no older than 16, with eyes too wise for his bones. He led them below, past barrels of olive oil and bolts of Tyrian-dyed linen. In the captain's quarters, they found a woman with weather-bitten skin and rings stacked on every finger. Her name was Ione, and her laugh sounded like sails catching wind. "You still breathe," she said to Moria with a wry smirk. "I thought Constantinople had eaten you." "I left before the feast," Moria replied. "I need passage." Ione studied the two of them, her eyes lingering on Leandros, his calloused hands. The ink smudges along his wrists, the faint scar beneath his chin, and him. He writes better than he fights, Moria said, but he learns quickly. The captain chuckled and waved them aboard. They did not sail that night. They waited, hidden in the lower hold, where salt rats nested in coils of rope and silence, pressed heavy like soaked wool. The city, above and around them, still dreamed, but dreams can curdle with a breath of suspicion. For, by morning, the news would spread, scrolls stolen from the patriarch's vault, panic in the bishop's office, blood money offered for whispers, and one name, perhaps spoken behind closed doors, would float upward from the gutters. Leia and Rose. He tried to rest, his back pressed against barrels of figs, the sway of the hull rocking him into a shallow drift. But sleep was brittle, interrupted by flashes, the glint of soldiers' spears, the look in Moria's eyes as she handed him the scroll, the scent of incense thick as guilt in the vault. Above, boots thudded. On the deck then, a shout, then silence. Leandros rose. Moria was already alert, crouched beside him like a panther mid-coil. They waited. A creak. A door opened. Ione entered, her face grim. "There's a man on the docks," she whispered, "dressed like a monk, but his hands don't match his robe." Moria's expression hardened. "The ink hunters," Leandros blinked. "The what?" "Imperial scribes," she said, "trained to kill. They find what's lost, and silence whoever found it first. The scrolls, of course." Leandros felt cold rise up his spine. Not fear, but the slow, cloying dread of someone realizing. They now stood in a chapter far darker than the one they intended to write. "What do they want?" he whispered. "To stop what you started." Ione handed Moria a wrapped bundle, no longer than a sword hilt, heavy with consequence. Moria unwrapped it slowly. Inside lay a scroll, not of parchment, but papyrus, brittle, faded, sealed with the insignia of Justinian himself. "What is it?" Leandros asked. Moria answered without looking at him. "A confession from a general. During the plague. Names of those who buried gold under the basilica. But why hide it? Because gold buys armies," she said, "but secrets buy empires." A plan emerged. Quiet, like steam from a kettle. Leandros would leave first, disguised as a fishmonger's apprentice. He would carry nothing but a basket of squid, beneath which he'd hide the less valuable scrolls. Moria would stay, drawing attention away, feeding misinformation into the ears of dockside informants. Ione's ship would sail that night, but not with both of them aboard. Leandros didn't want to go. "I won't leave you," he said. But Moria smiled, and her smile was not unkind. "You must, because one day someone must tell this story. And the only stories worth telling are the ones you survive." She pressed something into his palm, a locket, small and worn, containing a pressed violet. "Open it when the sea feels stillest," she whispered, and so, just before dawn, under the indifferent gaze of seagulls and saints, Leandros walked, away from the woman who had saved him once in blood, and now, in silence, he boarded a different ship, a smaller one, bound for Chios. The scrolls lay hidden beneath octopus tentacles, wrapped in oiled cloth. He sat beside barrels of anchovies, the scent of brine strong enough to mask fear. The wind picked up, sails unfurled, and Thessaloniki, the city of his rebirth, slipped behind him like a lover turning in sleep, as waves lapped the hull, and the sky turned a bruised lilac. Leandros opened the locket. Inside, beneath the violet, was a scrap of parchment no larger than his thumb. On it, in ink brown as blood, Moria had written, "Don't forget to write it well." And as the ship swayed into the open blue, Leandros began silently, lips forming words that no parchment had yet received. In the city of crossroads, where saints share alleys with thieves, I saw a woman stitch history back together with a needle made of secrets, and so the story sailed with him, past horizon and harbor into the hush of history, where only the waves knew what would come next. The bells tolled forenoon over the lavender fields outside Versailles, their iron tongues echoing over marbled courtyards and oak-lined alleys. A faint hush hovered over the palace grounds, as if even the trees dared not rustle while the king broke his fast late and slow in the Hall of Mirrors. The scent of roasted pears with anise and golden bread crust drifted across the orangery, kissed by the sun's wide arms that stretched through every arched window pane. Yet beneath the velvet splendor and shining glass, the quiet corridors held darker hues, ones not gilded by sunlight or silk. In her pale quarters, tucked at the far end of a lesser wing, Madame Eloise sat alone beside a harp that had not sung in weeks. Her fingers grazed the golden frame as if asking it permission, but silence, not melody, replied. The room was still, too still. No pages bustled, no friends called. Only her maid, Cecil, lingered at the threshold, hesitant. "You do not eat, madame," the maid said quietly, voice tinged with concern. "Shall I bring broth from the kitchens?" Eloise shook her head faintly. Her once rosy complexion had paled like a petal pressed too long between pages. "If I feed on anything now," she murmured. "Let it be letters," Cecil blinked. "Letters, madame." "Yes, bring me quill, ink, and paper. I would write. To myself, if no one else." For days, the only company Eloise had was the scratch of quill on linen parchment. She began to write confessions in secret reflections not meant for husband, court, or God, but for memory itself. She wrote of her early days in Burgundy, the orchard where she once raised her sisters, the books she devoured in Latin while others embroidered, the secret chapel where she first learned to pray for more than obedience. She wrote of marriage not as a sacrament, but a surrender. A girl of 17 promised to a man twice her age, whose only warmth had come on the wedding night and never after. She had not seen her husband in months. He resided in the East Wing with his mistress, a baroness whose name the servants whispered but never dared speak aloud before Eloise. The marriage was political, as all such were, and the king no longer sought her opinion in matters of alliances, silks, or even the breedings of horses. The queen herself, once her friend, had grown distant, but it was not bitterness Eloise recorded in her letters. It was beauty and longing and grace. She titled them "The Garden Behind the Eyes," and in them she dreamed of freedom, not in escape, but in presence, of being seen, not as a wife, not as a noblewoman, but as a soul with breath and weight. One mist-laden morning, as robins stitched song into the hedges outside her window, a knock disrupted her reverie. Cecil entered, eyes wider than usual. "Madame, there is a visitor, a gentleman. He claims you know him." Eloise rose slowly, who Cecil hesitated. An architect, from Burgundy. Her heart flickered like a startled flame. "Send him in," she said, breath catching at the memory of sketchbooks, red ink, and the scent of mortar. He entered slowly, reverently. Monsieur Thauvalin, the same man who had walked her family's vineyards in youth, dreaming aloud of arches and aqueducts. He bowed, not with courtly pomp, but with genuine regard. His coat was simple, his boots dusted from the road. And yet, to Eloise, he stood like marble amid paper. "My lady," he greeted, voice softer than memory. "I had hoped to find you, not forgotten." For a long breath, she said nothing. Then, faintly, "You came all the way from Burgundy." "I came from truth," he replied, "and from the ache of wondering what had become of the girl who once designed garden fountains with me." Eloise's throat tightened. In this palace, filled with falseness and performance, this was the first true moment she had tasted in seasons. They sat for hours. He spoke of projects he'd built, bridges in Marseille, a domed chapel in Toulouse. She listened, not as a duchess, but as Eloise, the girl who once traced starlight through lattice. That evening, she penned no letter, for her thoughts had found flesh, and her silence, company. In the days that followed, thou returned again and again, never formally invited, but always somehow welcomed. He brought sketches to show her blueprints that looked like dreams, and she brought forth her own drawings, finished designs for a hidden garden, a labyrinth of green spaces tucked behind the East Tower where no courtiers wandered. "I once imagined this as my sanctuary," she said as he unrolled her parchment on the table. "But there were never funds, nor interest." He leaned over the sketch. This could be real. You've mapped the sun's angles. The hedge placements create silence. The vines lead the eye inward." "Inward," she echoed. "Yes. That is where the true court resides." He looked up at her then, not as a noble, not as property, but as muse. "If you grant me permission," he said slowly, "I will build it. Not for the court, not for your husband, but for you." The words caught the wind from her lungs. "But the king would never approve. And I am no one to command marble and men." "You are the soul of this place," he replied. "It just forgot." In the weeks that followed, thou began quietly gathering materials. Stone from a ruined priory, vines from her childhood village. Each night, he brought her a handful of soil, as if sowing memory itself. The work began in secret. Only Cecil knew. Each brick placed beneath the moon, each root buried like confession. It was not grand, nothing Versailles would brag of, but it was sacred. And all the while Eloise wrote, but no longer letters of sorrow. She wrote of rhythm, of walls that embraced rather than confined, of hands that built instead of took. She titled the new volume Verses for a Garden, and bound them with soft violet ribbon. One afternoon, while strolling the eastern corridor under pretense of inspecting linens, she turned a corner and caught the king with the Baroness. Their laughter was a rusted sound. The Baroness wore Eloise's pearl comb, her comb. She paused, straightened her gown, and passed without curtsy. The king stopped mid-laugh. "Wife?" She turned only slightly. "Sire," his brow furrowed, perhaps expecting her usual deference. "You're looking different." "Change is natural," she said calmly, "as is decay." He blinked. She walked on. Later that week, word spread that the Queen had spoken with Eloise in the chapel gardens. No one heard the words, but they noted the Queen's silence after. And the next evening, Eloise was seen dining alone, but in the marble gallery, not her chamber. Something had shifted, not loudly, not rebelliously, but deeply. The garden behind the East Tower neared completion. Vines had begun to bloom. A fountain, modest but melodic, sang among lavender stalks. Thou worked late, hair silvered by stone dust, eyes bright with purpose. On the evening it was finished, he knocked at her door without gloves, or bow. "It's ready," he said. She followed him by lantern light. The halls of Versailles stretched behind her like discarded robes. When she stepped into the garden, a hush fell over her bones. The path was curved just as she'd drawn it. The ivy grew over the archway like scripture. A bench of rosewood waited beneath a willow. She touched it all, not with hand, but gaze. "Do you like it?" he asked, quieter than wind. "I love it," she whispered. For a time, they stood without speech. The moon laid lace across the cobbled path. Somewhere, a nightingale sang dot. And then, thou took her hand. She did not resist. Here, in this garden no king knew, no court judged. She was Eloise, not wife. Not duchess, just woman. Just soul, and the garden, her breath. The night had fallen gently upon Marseille, like a velvet glove brushed across an aching brow, cooling the cobblestones and silencing the gulls that circled the aging port. Beyond the shuttered windows of the widow's home, the city sighed with the muted sounds of distant footsteps, drunken sailors humming to themselves, and church bells that had long since surrendered to sleep. But inside the villa, candlelight flickered, not with haste, but with patience. The rooms breathed with the faint scent of lavender water and rose ash from the hearth. The widow sat once again before her bureau, fingers wrapped around the stem of a silver quill, as if each evening her hand returned to the same sacred ritual, not merely to record events, but to summon ghosts, her own and those of others. Tonight, she did not begin with the day's transactions, nor the imported spices from Barcelona, nor the quiet whisper from her maid that the bishop had visited the brothel on the Rue des Pines. No, this night called for something older, something aching. She leaned forward, her breath warming the page, and began Autumn, 1682. A whisper carried from the port to the gardens of the old palace, where figs rot on their boughs, and the marble fountains have long since run dry. He arrived, not as a merchant nor a soldier, but as a revenant. A man worn down by decisions made by others, his father's debts, his uncle's disgraces, the crown's wars. His name was Laurent de Castelnau. I was 38 when I met him, and he was barely 26. The pen paused, trembling for only a heartbeat, as if the memory pulled her breath toward the ribcage like a child clutching a mother's dress. He had hair the color of wheat soaked in salt water, eyes pale as blown glass, and a voice that never rose above the sound of evening crickets. But what struck me first, what made me watch him beyond the ordinary manners of a widow observing, a tenant, was the way he looked at the floor, always the floor, as though the earth carried guilt he dared not claim. She had rented him the lower apartment near the kitchens. It was small, sparse, and shaded by fig trees whose roots cracked. The stone wall. He asked no questions, paid with coin wrapped in Spanish linen, and thanked her with a bow so slight it could have been mistaken for sorrow. Days passed in mutual silence. He walked each morning to the cathedral, stood outside, and never entered. At night, he sat in the garden sketching maps not of cities or rivers, but of dreams. She saw them once, strewn across the table when he had stepped away. One had a sea shaped like an eye, another a tower with stairs climbing infinitely toward a moon that blinked. He never explained them, she never asked, but one October evening, he appeared at her door not to ask for salt or candles or directions, but to offer her a box, a simple cedar box, old and unpainted, with a single iron clasp. "For your kindness," he said, "for pretending not to notice my ghosts." Inside were for glass vials of perfume, not the kind sold in the shops by the harbour, but oils distilled from forgotten petals, amber roses, burned myrtle, and a scent she could only describe as night itself. "Where did you find these?" she had asked. "In dreams," he answered, "where the wind speaks French, but the flowers speak Greek." She kept them hidden for years, unopened. The day she buried her second husband, she wore one. The priest fainted from the smell. Laurent remained in the apartment through the winter. By February, the rumors began. A corsair had docked at the southern pier, sleek, foreign thing without flags. Some said it had been Turkish, others whispered Venetian. It stayed only 2 nights. Laurent vanished the morning after it left. She searched his rooms, desperate and half-mad. Every parchment was gone. Every sketch, every map, every vial. The fig leaves trembled above the doorway like a curtain mourning its actor. He was never seen again, not in Marseille, not in the ports of Algiers, not in the scrolls of the church's own inquisitors. Only the box remained. She stopped writing. Then the candle had slumped into its final curl of flame, leaving the room in amber hush. She stood slowly, her joints singing soft elegies of age, and crossed to the small cabinet near the hearth. From within, she withdrew the same cedar box. It bore no keyhole, no lock. But when her fingers brushed its lid, it whispered open, and inside, though she had checked it 1,000 times in the years before, were once again for vials, fresh, untouched, full dot, and the cento. The scent was not of perfume now, it was of the sea dot and of sorrow. Morning arrived without fanfare. A sun wrapped in grey clouds peered over the chimneys as if unsure whether to fully commit to the day. Mariette, the widow's maid, knocked twice before entering, tray in hand, tea, toast, and a folded note. The widow nodded absently. She hadn't truly slept. Her eyes carried the look of someone who had dreamed too deeply and come back too slowly. "The courier came again," Mariette said, laying down the envelope. She nodded again. This time, the letter bore the seal of the bishopric of Aix-en-Provence. She read it only once. "Madame de St. Lawrence, we write to inform you of a strange occurrence regarding the crypts beneath the Cathedral of St. Augustine. During a recent burial, a tomb previously thought empty was found sealed. Upon opening it, the clergy discovered a man preserved unnaturally, clutching a map drawn in ochre dot. The map bears your name and your likeness. We seek your counsel with urgency." She folded the letter slowly, placed it back on the tray, and looked toward the sea. "I was never good at running," she murmured, by midday. She had instructed Mariette to fetch the chest from the cellar, the one sealed since 1678, the one with her first husband's coat still folded inside, and the pistol. Mariette, wise enough to sense something stirring beneath the calm, said nothing. By afternoon, she wore traveling clothes, a deep blue dress lined with silk braid, a mantle embroidered with cypress branches, and her late husband's signet ring. She mounted the carriage not as a widow, nor as a lady of letters, nor even as a relic of the old merchant elite. She rode as something altogether older. By the time the carriage reached Aix-en-Provence, the bells were already tolling, not for mass, not for mourning, but for warning. The cathedral stood like a stone, sentinel against the trembling sky. Its towers, veined with moss, seemed to lean slightly as if eavesdropping upon the square. Monks gathered like moths near the cloisters, whispering not prayers but fears. She stepped through the archway with the grace of a woman who remembered when its stones were laid. The bishop, a thin man named Gerard, met her at the stairs to the crypt. I expected someone older, he said, not unkindly. She smiled. I expected someone taller. He led her downward. Torches sputtered in sconces. The air changed, thickening not with decay but with memory, and something colder than cold. The tomb was open, its walls lined with strange markings, not Latin, not Greek. Inside lay the figure. Young, preserved, pale. His hands clutching a scroll, and on the scroll, unmistakable, was her name. Madeleine de Saint Lawrence, it read. Keep to the tides. She stepped forward, reached for the scroll, and as her fingers touched it, the figure's eyes opened, but no scream echoed through the crypt. No panic tore through the cathedral. Instead, the stone itself seemed to sigh, a long, patient, exhausted breath, and then silence. She looked at the man in the tomb older now, no longer boyish. It was Laurent. He smiled with lips that barely moved. You opened the box, he whispered. Why? She asked. Because some ghosts are anchors, and others are sails. That night, Mariette waited for hours in the villa, the tea growing cold and the vials on the mantel still aglow with moonlight. She never returned, only a map remained. Pressed to the glass of the window, it showed a sea with no name and a single tower, rising into the stars, and beneath it the words, "In dreams we sail again." The wind rose across Marseille. The fig trees bowed in silence, and from the sea came the scent, salt and sorrow and perfume of a woman who had remembered not only who she was, but what she was. And that was how the widow of Marseille disappeared, not with a scream, but with a map and a dream. It fell in soft, sighing blankets across the wide roof tiles of the inner palace, cloaking the courtyards in a hush that even the cicadas of summer could no longer pierce. The world had dimmed into alabaster silence only, the crunch of the guards, footsteps, and the faint rustle of the plum trees offered contrast to the stillness that winter had spun like silk over the forbidden city. You sat by the latticed window of her new residence, the sleeve of her silken robe tucked beneath her hands, which cradled a ceramic cup filled with ginger tea. The warmth seeped into her skin, but her thoughts had drifted beyond the snow and the frost-painted tiles. Somewhere past the white haze, past the long curved walls and the inner gardens, Emperor Wu was likely holding audience, cloaked in layers of brocade, his voice echoing within the hall of supreme harmony. She hadn't seen him in 4 days, and yet absence no longer brought her pain, it brought perspective. In her quiet retreat, she had grown. She had begun to write again. Each morning, she copied the poems of Du Fu and Li Qingzhao into silk-bound scrolls. Their ink flowed like thoughts unfurling in solitude, weightless and deep. As the snow deepened outside, she added her own verses. To the end of each piece, careful not to disturb the style, respectful of the lineage. But there, at the bottom of every poem, you left her mark a single line, quiet and sharp like the edge of a winter moon. One evening, a low knock stirred her from her writing. It was Lady Zun, the once aloof first consort, usually surrounded by silk-clad attendants and perfumed with arrogance, now stood alone. Her robes were plain, her eyes rimmed with fatigue, but there was a softness in her voice you had never heard before. "He's sick," Lady Zun said simply. "The Emperor. Fever. 3 nights now." Yu's breath caught. "I thought you should know," Lady Zun continued, looking not at Yu, but at the falling snow behind her. "He said your name in his sleep, repeatedly." You set down her brush. The scroll before her fluttered in the draught from the window. She didn't speak. She rose. The silence between the two women, once bridged by envy, now bound by something closer to quiet understanding, was not broken. It merely lingered as they walked side by side down the quiet corridors of the forbidden city. The palace doctors moved aside when they arrived. They didn't ask questions. You sat at the emperor's bedside through the night, holding a cold cloth to his brow, whispering verses and stories. Soft lullabies she had learned from her mother long before she became concubine, when she was still just a girl from the southern lakes. He tossed and turned through dreams riddled with fever and memory. He mumbled names, some of them ministers, others ancestors. A few were people long past, but always he returned to one name, you. The morning broke slowly. Snow still fell, thinner now, melting on the carved stone lions outside the chamber. The sun crept over the eaves like a thief, afraid of waking the gods. You had not slept. Her hands were wrapped around his, and his pulse had steadied. The color returned to his cheeks little by little, as if coaxed back by her presence. When he finally opened his eyes, weak and heavy, he smiled. "You came," he said, voice rough like sand over silk. You nodded once. There was nothing to say. The silence spoke louder than any proclamation. The court resumed its duties slowly, and you remained at his side. Not as a healer, not as a consort, but as something more elusive, something unnamed in all the scrolls and edicts. The winter deepened. You walked the gardens often, her sleeves brushing frost-covered leaves. The plum blossoms had not yet bloomed, but the branches were thick with promise. As she walked, she whispered her poems to the air, knowing the wind would carry them to places the ear could not reach. One morning, a eunuch approached her, bowed deeply. "The emperor has instructed a scroll be delivered to you," he said. She opened it slowly. It was a decree, handwritten in Emperor Wu's own script. No title, no edict, just one line. If the moon could speak, she would take your name. She folded the paper with shaking hands. Not all love stories in the palace were grand. Not all of them ended in splendor or ruin. Some simply endured, like the snow that returned each year, soft and unyielding, like the tea that steeped on her windowsill, like a name whispered in sleep when the body forgets the world, but the soul remembers, and you, once a simple offering to the throne, now lived like the poems she wrote, quiet, enduring, stitched into the fabric of the court, not by power or beauty, but by grace. She had learned not to seek the light, but to reflect it. And in the still hush of a forbidden city winter, that light found her. Softly, gently, the sea sang under moonlight, and Venice, draped in her silks of starlight and salt, exhaled a breath both final and timeless. Atop the quietest canal, under the leaning arms of the Ponte del Paradiso, the old lanterns swayed with a flicker that whispered the end of a tale. For Bianca della Rovere, the merchant queen of Venice, had returned once more to the place where it all began. She had grown old with the city, not in the way stone ages or wood rots, but in the way a candle dances lower, more tenderly, more wisely, as it nears its final pool of wax. Her hair was no longer flame, but silver frost, her hands not smooth as rose-petaled youth, but worn-creased, like a chart of the Adriatic itself. And still, her mind was sharp, sharper than the knives of her Genoese rivals, sharper than the tolls of the Doge's court. Her eyes could still see trade winds before they blew, still smell betrayal before it unfolded like a fan. still hear profit in the clatter of foreign tongues, but tonight the numbers were behind her. The ledgers closed, the ships docked. The gold stacked high in quiet vaults beneath her estate, and her soul had begun to drift like incense through the rafters of the cathedral at San Zaccaria. The lagoon that had once shimmered with ambitions and threats was now a mirror, reflecting not power but peace. Asterisk, she had, in her final years, taken 2 evening walks through the maze of bridges, cloaked not in silk but in soft wool, with no guards, no advisors, no pretense that those same people who once watched her with suspicion, even contempt, now greeted her like an ancient saint who'd lived among them. Children ran to touch her hand, fishermen bowed, widows offered prayers to her health, and though she offered no great speeches, her quiet presence beneath the moon had become a nightly benediction. It was said she had become part of Venice herself, a living relic, neither canonized nor crowned, but revered all the same. Asterisk. The last chapter of her life unfolded in the shadows of lace-curtained windows, with letters still flowing in from Alexandria, Lisbon, Krakow, and beyond. She read each one with a slow, deliberate grace, fingertips passing over inked hopes, like a mother stroking her child's brow, from her granddaughter, Isabella, now overseeing spice routes in the Levant. From Niccolo, once a street urchin, now a merchant of salt in Tunis. From George Lorenzo's son, now married into the Medici, thanking her for a forgotten loan. The world had changed, but she had seeded that change. She had sown wealth into desolate pockets, discipline into chaos, grace into ambition. But her greatest pride was not in coin, nor power, nor the grand palazzo that bore her sigil. It was in the girls she had taught, in the way they stood at auctions and negotiated silk prices, in the way they quoted Marcus Aurelius at banquets, in the way they no longer asked permission to own ships, but demanded better ports. Her academy had grown. 30 years later, it was no longer mocked, but mimicked. Even Florence sent daughters now. Even Rome whispered of a Bianca model for reform. Asterisk, on the night she knew would be her last. There was no thunder, no storm, no omen, only stillness, as if the entire lagoon had paused for her one last time. She sat before her window, the one that faced west toward San Giorgio Maggiore, and watched the sky melt into clementine and blush. Her hand rested on a book of accounts, though the ink had dried long ago. Beside it a single pearl, the first she had ever traded. From her very first ship, still unstrung, still luminous, still hers, she smiled, and then, simply, let go. Asterisk. The city mourned, not with bells, but with silence. No gondoliers sang that dawn, no traders haggled, no cats cried along the canals. From Rialto to the Lido, lanterns burned white. Across rooftops, her standard-an olive tree wrapped in gold cord was hung upside down. Women wept openly. Men lowered their hats. And the girls of her academy lit candles by the thousand, lining the steps of the Basilica dei Frari, each flame a promise to never return to silence. She was buried not in the traditional vaults of nobles, but in the old merchant quarter she'd fought to preserve, in Campo San Polo, under the ancient fig tree, where beggars once lined to receive alms from her hand. Her tomb was plain, carved not from marble, but from Venetian oak, polished smooth by the hands of those who loved her, and on it a single line: she turned salt into gold, and silence into empire. Asterisk, asterisk, but Venice does not forget. And so, when the bells toll, now at dusk, when the fog rolls in over the lagoon, and the city returns to her breathless quiet, some say they see her shadow near the dock, that slight figure, the silver braid, the gait of a woman who knew where every tide turned. They say her scent still lingers where jasmine meets sea air, that her laugh still echoes where the women gather, that her presence remains wherever courage is whispered in a girl's ear. And maybe that's how stories end, not in death, but in becoming part of the place that made them. Bianca della Rovere, the merchant queen of Venice. She lived, she ruled, and then she dissolved into the city she loved forever, part of its tides, its stones, its stories, and so the waters close gently over her memory, not with sorrow, but with reverence. Sleep now, traveller. The ships are at rest. The gold has been counted. The queen sleeps, and Venice, ever watchful, guards her still.